The Two Men in Lead Masks. August 20th, 1966. On a densely wooded hill in the city of Niterói, in the Brazilian state of Rio de Janeiro, a young boy flying a kite with his friends suddenly noticed something strange. Amid the tall grass and the rocks scattered across the hillside, two men were lying motionless. At first, no one thought it was a crime scene. From a distance, they looked like two hikers resting after climbing the hill. But the closer the boy came, the stranger the scene became. The two men were lying side by side. Both were dressed in formal suits. Over them, they wore raincoats. There were no signs of panic, no blood, no evidence that they had tried to run. But the most haunting detail was that each man had a mask made of lead, covering his face. These were not costume masks, nor were they standard protective equipment. They were simply pieces of lead cut by hand, bent to fit closely over the face, and covering the eyes completely. There were no straps, no openings to see through, as though they had never been designed to help the wearer see anything at all. When the police arrived at the scene, they quickly realized this was not a robbery. The victims still had cash in their pockets. Their watches were still on their wrists. Nothing of value had been taken. There were no signs of a struggle, no unusual footprints, no spent shell casings, no murder weapon, and no obvious injuries on either body. Everything suggested that the two men had come to this place of their own free will. They had sat down, then lay back, and never stood up again. But that was only the beginning. As investigators searched the scene, they discovered a small piece of paper, carefully folded. The handwriting was brief, unsigned, undated. It contained only a few simple instructions. 4:30 p.m. Be at the agreed location. Looting 7:15 p.m. Take the capsule. After the capsule takes effect, protect the metals. Wait for the signal. Put on the masks. No one knew who had written it. No one knew what kind of capsule they were supposed to take. No one knew what signal they were waiting for. And to this day, no one has been able to explain what the phrase, protect the metals, was actually meant to mean. Just a few short lines, yet enough to transform an already baffling death into one of the most enduring mysteries in Brazilian history. When the victims were finally identified, the case became even more puzzling. They were not criminals, not smugglers, nor were they scientists involved in a secret military project. They were simply two ordinary electronics technicians. They had steady jobs, families, friends. No one who knew them believed they had any reason to take their own lives, and even fewer could imagine that they would climb a remote hillside together, put on strange lead masks, and die at exactly the same moment. The investigation gradually uncovered a world that few people knew existed, a world where science and belief sometimes blurred into one another, where electronics enthusiasts believed that radio waves could connect to other dimensions, where spiritual gatherings attracted engineers, businessmen, and well-educated professionals alike, and where the idea of communicating with extraterrestrial beings was not considered entirely irrational. It was from that world that countless theories began to emerge. Some believed the two men had taken part in an occult ritual. Others argued they were conducting a scientific experiment that ended in disaster. Some suspected they had been poisoned. Others insisted this was an expertly staged murder. And of course, there was the theory that would become the most famous of them all, that the two men had been trying to make contact with extraterrestrials. Nearly 6 decades have passed. Thousands of pages of case files have been examined. Journalists, investigators, researchers, and countless enthusiasts of unsolved mysteries have all tried to piece together the fragments that remain. But the outcome has never changed. No definitive cause of death has ever been established. No killer has ever been identified. No confession has ever surfaced, and no witness ever saw what truly happened on that hillside, on that fateful evening. All that remains are 2 lead masks. A small note filled with cryptic instructions, and a question that has remained unanswered for nearly 60 years. Why did the two men climb Morro do Vintém? To answer that question, we have to return to Brazil in the 1960s, where it all began with two seemingly ordinary men. Brazil, Lil. Two ordinary men, and a world of mysterious beliefs. To understand why those two men appeared on Morro do Vintém wearing lead masks, we need to return to Brazil. In the 1960s, it was a country changing at extraordinary speed. After the Second World War, Brazil entered a period of rapid industrialization. Major cities such as Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Niterói expanded at an unprecedented pace. Electricity, radio, television, and electronic devices were gradually becoming familiar parts of everyday life. People who knew how to repair machinery, assemble radios, or build electronic equipment were considered highly skilled workers. That was also the profession of the two victims in this case. But alongside the rise of science, another movement was growing. One that may seem difficult to believe today. A widespread fascination with supernatural phenomena. During the Enigmas and Enigmas, it wasn't just Brazil. Much of the world experienced a surge of fascination with UFOs, after pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing mysterious flying objects over the United States in 1947. And following the Roswell incident, later that same year, the public became increasingly captivated by the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Books, radio programs, research clubs, small public lectures. Everywhere, people debated the mystery of unidentified flying objects. Brazil was no exception. In fact, it became one of the countries that recorded a remarkably high number of UFO sightings throughout the 20th century. Although most of those reports could never be verified, they helped create a unique atmosphere, one where science and imagination sometimes became impossible to separate. At the same time, another movement was rapidly gaining momentum. It was Spiritism, a religious and philosophical movement, heavily influenced by the teachings of Allan Kardec. It's important to emphasize, not everyone who followed Spiritism believed in UFOs or took part in unusual rituals. Most practiced their faith peacefully, focusing on morality, prayer, and the belief in the existence of the soul. However, alongside these mainstream groups, smaller circles began to emerge. They blended Spiritism with other ideas. They spoke of cosmic energy, frequencies, and the possibility of communicating with beings from another dimension. Some believed that if human beings could tune themselves to the right radio frequency, or enter the proper state of consciousness, they might receive messages from intelligent life beyond Earth. Today, such ideas are often regarded as unscientific, but at the time, even many well-educated people took them seriously. One fascinating detail is that many of these groups were not made up of uneducated people. Quite the opposite. There were engineers, electronics technicians, office workers, business owners. They did not see themselves as superstitious. They believed they were exploring phenomena that modern science had yet to explain. Some built their own radio transmitters and receivers. Others experimented with magnetic fields. Some studied hypnosis or altered states of consciousness. The line between genuine scientific inquiry and personal belief was often difficult to distinguish. It was in this world that two men named Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz entered the story. Miguel José Viana was 34 years old. Manuel Pereira da Cruz was slightly younger. Both lived in the city of Campos dos Goytacazes, in the state of Rio de Janeiro. They were more than casual acquaintances. They were close partners, working together to repair and assemble electronic equipment. Their neighbors remembered them as quiet men, hard-working, polite, and never the source of trouble. No one had ever heard of them being involved with criminal organizations. They had no criminal records, no significant debts, and no known serious conflicts with anyone. They had families, steady jobs, and lives that, from the outside, appeared completely ordinary. But Like many electronics enthusiasts of that era, Miguel and Manuel shared an unusual fascination. They were deeply interested in radio technology. They often built their own electronic components, taking devices apart, assembling new circuits, and experimenting with different ways of transmitting signals. According to people who knew them, the two men were also interested in spiritual phenomena and discussions about communicating with unseen entities. One point is important to make clear. There is no evidence that either of them belonged to a secret cult or an extremist organization. That is a claim many later accounts greatly exaggerated. What the investigation actually established was far more modest. They had an interest in electronics, radio signals, and certain activities with a spiritual or mystical element. How deeply they truly believed in those ideas, or how far they became involved, remains impossible to determine with certainty. Another detail is worth noting. In the months leading up to their deaths, several people who knew Miguel and Manuel noticed that they were spending a great deal of time attending meetings related to these interests. They often discussed electronic equipment, recorded long lists of numbers, and occasionally spoke about upcoming experiments. Unfortunately, no one knows exactly what those discussions were about. There were no audio recordings, no complete written records, only memories collected after both men were already dead. That left investigators facing a difficult challenge. They could not be certain what was fact, what had been altered by the passage of time, and what had simply been added later, after the case had become famous. If you looked only at Miguel and Manuel's lives before August 1966, there was nothing to suggest they were about to become the central figures in one of the world's greatest unsolved mysteries. They were not explorers, not spies, not scientists working on a top-secret project. They were simply two ordinary men with ordinary jobs and a hobby shared by thousands of Brazilians at the time. But then, in the space of just a few days, everything changed. The two men left home with a simple explanation. They told their families they were traveling to the city of Niterói to buy electronic components for work. No one questioned their story. No one tried to stop them. And no one knew it would be the last time they were ever seen alive. The final journey. From an ordinary morning to a meeting no one ever returned from. On the morning of August 17th, 1966, for the families of Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, it seemed like a perfectly ordinary day. There was no sign of the tragedy to come, no arguments, no emotional farewells, and no indication that either man was anxious or afraid. They left the city of Campos dos Goytacazes, more than 250 kilometers from Niterói. The reason they gave their families was simple. They were going to buy electronic components and equipment. There was nothing unusual about that at the time. Many high-quality electronic parts could only be found in larger cities such as Niterói or Rio de Janeiro. Trips like these were a routine part of their work. So, no one asked any questions. No one imagined that this would be the last time they ever walked out of their homes. Before setting out, Miguel carried a sum of cash with him according to the investigation. It was enough to purchase the electronic equipment they intended to buy. Manuel packed only a small bag. Neither man brought clothes for an overnight stay. That suggests, at least according to their original plan, this was meant to be nothing more than a day trip. They expected to return home before nightfall. There is no evidence that either of them was preparing to flee or planning to disappear. After several hours of travel, the two men arrived in Niterói that afternoon. At the time, Niterói was one of the most important cities in the state of Rio de Janeiro. From there, the city of Rio could be seen across Guanabara Bay. The streets were crowded. Buses came and went constantly. Electronics stores had begun appearing throughout the city to meet the public's growing demand. No one paid any attention to the two men stepping off the bus. To everyone around them, they were simply two ordinary visitors. The last known witness to see Miguel and Manuel alive was an employee at a clothing store. According to the statement later recorded by police, the two men entered the shop and asked to buy 2 raincoats. The request immediately struck the employee as unusual, because that day the weather was hot, the sky was clear, and there was no sign of rain. The salesperson even asked whether they truly needed the raincoats, but the two men insisted. They did not bargain, they did not hesitate, they paid and walked away. It was the last confirmed sighting of Miguel and Manuel while they were still alive. The 2 raincoats would later become one of the most debated details in the entire case. If they were simply meant to keep out the rain, the weather that day offered no reason to buy them. If they were intended to provide warmth, the thin plastic raincoats would have done little to help. So, why did they buy them? Over the years, countless theories have emerged. Some believe the raincoats were meant to protect their clothing during a chemical experiment. Others suggest they were intended to shield them from dust or liquid. Still others have speculated that the two men believed the raincoats could insulate them from electricity or lessen the effects of some unknown form of energy. However, one point is important to keep in mind. There is no official investigative record that explains the purpose of the 2 raincoats. Every explanation remains nothing more than speculation. After leaving the store, Miguel and Manuel's trail all but disappeared. There were no security cameras, no location tracking, no mobile phones. In Itululil, reconstructing a person's movements depended almost entirely on eyewitness accounts. And if no one happened to notice, their trail simply vanished. In the years that followed, investigators tried to determine who the two men had met, whether they had stopped anywhere to eat, whether they had visited any electronics stores, or whether they had taken a taxi or a local bus. But most of those questions were never answered with certainty. What makes this especially noteworthy is that, based on everything the police were able to reconstruct, there was no sign that the two men had been forced to go anywhere. No one saw them arguing with anyone. No witness reported seeing them being followed. And there were no reports of a daylight abduction, if there really was a third person involved. That individual appears to have approached Miguel and Manuel in a completely ordinary way. Ordinary enough that no one around them took notice. It is a possibility that many investigators later came to consider the most likely, because the evidence at the final scene suggested that the two men had gone to the hill of their own free will. As night fell, their families back in Campos dos Goitacazes waited for them to return. But as the hours passed, there was no knock at the door, no phone call, no message. At first, everyone assumed their bus had been delayed, or that they had decided to stay overnight because their work had taken longer than expected. Back then, communication between cities was nothing like it is today. No one immediately imagined the worst. But by the following day, the silence had become deeply unsettling. Miguel and Manuel had never disappeared without telling their families. Their relatives began contacting friends, co-workers, and the places the two men were known to visit. No one knew where they were. No one had heard from them. Meanwhile, just a few kilometers from the place where they had last been seen, on the slope of Morro do Vintem, the two men already lay motionless. No one knows exactly when they died, and no one knows who they met or what they were truly waiting for during the final hours of their lives. 3 days later, a young boy was flying a kite on the hillside when he accidentally spotted two figures lying motionless in the grass. He had no way of knowing that what seemed like a chance discovery would become the beginning of one of the strangest criminal investigations in Brazilian history. The scene on Morro do Vintem. Every clue led to an even greater mystery. 3 days after Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz left home on the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, Morro do Vintem, a hillside on the outskirts of Niterói, was as quiet as ever. It was not a popular tourist destination, nor was it a place where many people passed through. The hillside was covered with tall grass, dense brush, and large rocks. From the top, It overlooked part of the city and Guanabara Bay. Perhaps because of its secluded landscape, few could have imagined that it would become the scene of one of the most mysterious criminal cases of the 20th century. That afternoon, a group of boys climbed the hill to fly kites, according to multiple accounts of the case. One of them noticed two light-colored shapes lying on the hillside in the distance. At first, the boys assumed they were simply people resting, but as they looked more closely, neither figure moved. The distance was too great, and they were too frightened to approach. Instead, they ran back down the hill to alert the adults. Several local residents then climbed up to investigate. When they reached the spot, they immediately realized something was terribly wrong. The two men were dead. The police were called to the scene shortly afterward, however. Reaching the site was far from easy. The path up the hill was steep. No vehicle could make it all the way to the top. Investigators had to carry their equipment, cameras, and forensic tools on foot. As a result, securing the scene proved difficult. Before the authorities arrived, several curious locals had already made their way to the area today. A crime scene like this would be sealed off immediately. But in Itululu, criminal investigation procedures in Brazil were not nearly as rigorous as they are today. That meant some of the original evidence may have been unintentionally disturbed. This detail is critically important because many of the theories that emerged in later years were built upon a crime scene that may no longer have been completely intact. As investigators began documenting every detail, the scene before them was deeply puzzling. The two bodies lay only a short distance apart. There was no sign that one man had tried to drag the other. No defensive wounds. No indication of a violent struggle or intense suffering. Everything appeared almost too peaceful, as though the two men had willingly lain down where they were found. If this had been a poisoning, why hadn't they tried to run? If it was murder, why was there no evidence of resistance? And if it had been an accident, what could possibly have caused it? From the very first moments, the scene raised far more questions than it answered. Both Miguel and Manoa were neatly dressed. Each was wearing a suit. Their shirts were fully buttoned. Their shoes were still on their feet. Over their clothes, they wore the raincoats they had purchased earlier that day. There were no tears in their clothing. Very little dirt or mud clung to them. They did not look like men who had just struggled for their lives. This led investigators to rule out the possibility that the two had been chased across the rugged hillside. If an attack had taken place, it had left almost no trace on their clothing. Then the investigators' attention settled on the strangest detail of all. Covering each victim's face was a mask made of lead. These were not commercially manufactured objects. Even at a glance, it was clear that they had been cut from thin sheets of lead and bent into shape by hand. Their design was simple. They covered only the eyes. There were no lenses, no straps, and no mechanism that would allow the wearer to see through them. When positioned over the face, the person wearing one would have been almost completely unable to see what was in front of them. That single detail immediately pushed the investigation in an entirely different direction. Why would anyone willingly cover their own eyes just before they died? At first, some investigators believed the masks might have been intended to protect the wearers from an intense source of light. In certain professions, lead masks or specially filtered goggles are used to shield the eyes from radiation. But there was one major problem. There was no other equipment at the scene, no source of radiation, no machinery, no sign that any kind of scientific experiment had taken place. There were only two lead masks and two bodies. Every theory that emerged quickly ran into a dead end. The search continued. Investigators examined the victims' pockets. If this had been a robbery, the killer would almost certainly have taken their money. But the reality was quite the opposite. Cash was still there. Several banknotes had been neatly folded. Their wristwatches were still on their wrists. There was no sign that anyone had deliberately searched through their jacket or trouser pockets. Their other personal belongings had been left untouched as well. This all but ruled out robbery as the motive for the killings. At the very least, a financial motive did not fit the evidence at the scene. Another detail also caught the investigators' attention. There was no food, no bottles of water, no sign that the two men had planned to remain on the hill for very long. They seemed to have brought only what was necessary for a brief meeting that fit with what their families had believed, that they would be home the very same day. But if that was true, who had they gone up the hill to meet? And if someone had arranged the meeting, that person had vanished without leaving a single trace. As the search continued, investigators discovered a small item inside one of the victim's pockets. It was a neatly folded piece of paper. At first glance, there seemed to be nothing remarkable about it. No name, no address, no signature. But that single note would transform a strange pair of deaths into a mystery that would be debated across Brazil for decades. Because the words written on it did not appear to be random notes. They read more like the steps of a carefully prepared plan. A plan that Miguel and Manuel seemed determined to carry out to the very end. But who had written those instructions? What exactly was the pill mentioned in the note? What did it mean to wait for the signal? And why was the final step, put on the masks? The mysterious note. 6 lines that have puzzled the world for nearly 6 decades. In most criminal investigations, detectives hope the crime scene will leave behind a clue, a letter, a notebook, a phone number, or, at the very least, a name, because sometimes just one small detail is enough to send an investigation in an entirely new direction. In the lead masks case, police found something like that, a small piece of paper, carefully folded. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary note. But after reading its contents, investigators realized they were holding the strangest piece of evidence in the entire case. The note itself was brief. There was no explanation, no recipient, no signature, only a series of instructions. According to the investigative records, it read, 4:30 p.m. Arrive at the designated location. Ludane Sessionfin p.m. Take the pill. After the pill takes effect, protect the metals. Wait for the signal. Put on the masks. Just a few short lines, yet every one of them raised another question. The first thing that caught the investigators' attention was the way the note had been written. It did not resemble an ordinary reminder. Instead, it looked like a checklist, a sequence of steps that had to be followed in a specific order. Each action served a purpose. Each one followed a clear timeline. The instructions were carefully structured. That suggested the writer was not recording events that had already happened. They were preparing for something that was yet to take place. And most likely, Miguel and Manuel had carried the note with them as a set of instructions to follow. Now, look at the very first line. 4:30 p.m. Arrive at the designated location. That alone strongly suggests the two men did not go up the hill by chance. There had been an appointment. A meeting place had been agreed upon in advance. But with whom? To this day, investigators have never identified the person they were supposed to meet. There was no invitation, no recorded phone call, no witness who ever reported seeing a third person accompany the two men up the hill. If someone really had been waiting for them, that person disappeared without leaving a single trace. The second line made the case even more perplexing. Lutein 7fin, p.m. Take the pill. Immediately, investigators were faced with a critical question. Where was the pill? They searched the entire scene. They examined the victim's pockets. They checked the raincoats. They found no pills, no pill bottle, no blister pack, no prescription. If the two men had already taken the pill, then whatever had contained it had disappeared. If they had not yet taken it, then the pill itself was nowhere to be found. Either possibility was difficult to explain. The autopsy offered no clear answers either. The bodies were discovered several days later in hot, humid conditions. By then, decomposition had progressed significantly. As a result, Identifying certain substances in the bodies became extremely difficult. The forensic experts at the time were unable to determine the exact cause of death, nor could they conclusively establish that the two men had died from any specific drug or poison. This is a crucial point. Many accounts published over the years have claimed that they died from poison. But in reality, the official investigation never confirmed that conclusion. The instruction to take the pill appears only in the note. Whether the two men actually took one remains an unanswered question to this day. The next line read, "After the pill takes effect." If this plan truly belonged to the two victims, then they were clearly expecting the pill to produce some kind of effect. Perhaps it was meant to induce drowsiness. Perhaps it was intended to alter their state of consciousness. Or perhaps it was simply a stimulant. But all of these are nothing more than speculation. There is no evidence identifying what kind of pill it was, and no medical expert has ever been able to determine what effect the writer was referring to. Then came the most cryptic line of all: "Protect the metals." In the original Portuguese, this phrase has been the subject of debate as well. Because it is so brief and lacks any clear context, it can be interpreted in several different ways. Some believe it was an instruction to protect a metal object. Others argue it meant using metal as a form of protection. There is also a theory that the phrase referred to shielding against some kind of radiation or an intense source of light. But every one of these interpretations remains speculative. No official document has ever definitively explained what the phrase was meant to convey, and it is precisely that ambiguity that has given rise to dozens of competing theories over the decades. Then came the next line: "Wait for the signal." This is perhaps the phrase that has fueled the public's imagination more than any other. What was the signal? A sound? A flash of light? A radio transmission? Or simply a sign from someone waiting nearby? If Miguel and Manuel were indeed fascinated by electronics and radio communication, as people who knew them later told investigators, then the possibility that they were waiting for some kind of technical signal cannot be ruled out. But neither is there any evidence to support it. No radio transmitter or receiver was found at the scene. No measuring instruments. No antenna. If such equipment had ever been there, it had disappeared before the police arrived. Or it had never been taken up the hill in the first place. Finally came the shortest line of all: "Put on the masks." It was also the final step in the entire sequence. This detail matched the scene perfectly, because when Miguel and Manuel were found, both men were wearing the lead masks. That suggests at least part of the instructions had been carried out. But why wait until the very last step to put them on, if the purpose was to protect their eyes? Wouldn't they have worn them from the beginning, if they were meant to shield against a bright light? What light were they waiting for, if they were intended to protect against radiation? Where was the source? None of those questions has ever been answered. One more detail drew the investigators' close attention: the handwriting on the note, after comparing it with known samples. Police concluded that it was most likely written by Miguel José Viana. However, that did not necessarily mean Miguel had come up with the plan himself. He could simply have been copying instructions from someone else, or writing down directions that had already been agreed upon. The case file does not allow for a definitive conclusion, and it is precisely that uncertainty that has made the note both the most important piece of evidence and the most difficult to explain. While investigators were still struggling to make sense of the 6 mysterious lines, another question emerged. If the plan had been prepared so carefully, why hadn't the two men left any message for their families? Why were they dressed in neatly pressed suits, carrying cash, yet not carrying the electronic equipment that many believe would have been essential for their supposed experiment? And most importantly, if they were truly following someone else's instructions, where was that person? The 2 lead masks, the strangest piece of evidence, and the theories that were never proven. If the mysterious note was the heart of the investigation, then the 2 lead masks became the symbol that made this case known around the world. For nearly 60 years, whenever people mention the lead masks case, the first image that comes to mind is not the names of the two victims. It is two men in suits lying motionless on a hillside, with lead masks covering their eyes. That haunting image has appeared in hundreds of newspapers, dozens of books, and countless documentaries about history's greatest unsolved mysteries. But the most remarkable part is this. Even today, no one knows with certainty what those masks were actually made for. After collecting the evidence, police conducted a detailed examination of the two masks. At first glance, their construction was remarkably simple. There were no electronic components, no wires, no batteries, no specialized mechanisms of any kind. They were nothing more than thin sheets of lead, cut by hand and carefully bent to fit the shape of a face. They were just large enough to cover the eyes. The edges had been neatly finished, suggesting that whoever made them had taken their time. These were not factory-made items, nor did they resemble anything commercially available. Most likely, they had been custom-made for a specific purpose. One detail, in particular, caught the investigators' attention. The two masks were almost identical. That suggested they had not been made on impulse. Someone had planned this in advance. Or perhaps Miguel and Manuel had prepared them together. If that was the case, then putting on the masks was not a last-minute decision. It was part of a plan that had likely been carefully thought out, days, or perhaps even weeks, before they climbed the hill. The next detail left everyone even more puzzled. It was the design of the masks themselves. Normally, protective masks are made with openings to see through, or, at the very least, they allow the wearer to remain aware of their surroundings. But these lead masks did not. They completely covered the eyes, once worn in the intended position. The wearer would have been almost completely blind. That raises a very simple question. If their purpose was protection, protection from what? And why would anyone willingly sacrifice the ability to see? As soon as photographs of the crime scene were released, Brazilian newspapers began publishing a wave of speculation. Some claimed the two men had been carrying out a secret nuclear experiment. Others suggested they had been preparing to observe an extremely powerful source of light. The sensational headlines quickly captured the public's imagination. But as investigators examined each theory, most of them proved to have little or no factual basis. There was no evidence of radioactive materials, no energy-generating equipment, no crime scene evidence indicating that any kind of scientific experiment had taken place. In the end, all that remained were the two lead masks. Some experts later proposed a more grounded explanation. According to them, lead is capable of absorbing certain types of radiation. In many medical and industrial settings, lead is used to manufacture protective shielding. However, that does not mean that every piece of lead provides meaningful protection, especially thin sheets of lead that cover only the eyes. If the wearer were truly exposed to a dangerous source of radiation, shielding only the eyes would have offered very little protection. The rest of the body would still have been exposed. In other words, if these were meant to be anti-radiation devices, their design was far too rudimentary. Another theory emerged from the note itself. One of its final instructions read, "Put on the masks." Many people believe the two men expected to witness an intensely bright light. It may have been a light they intended to produce themselves, or it may have been something they believed would appear after they had waited for the signal. If that was the case, the masks were not meant to shield them from radiation. They were intended to protect their eyes from a blinding light. At first glance, that theory seems more plausible. But then, another question arises. If they were waiting for some kind of brilliant light, did it ever appear? No one knows. No witness reported seeing an unusual light on the hill that night. There were no official reports of any extraordinary natural phenomenon, no scorched ground, no physical evidence of any kind. Over the years, the lead masks became linked to even more sensational theories. Some authors claimed Miguel and Manuel believed they were about to encounter extraterrestrials, and that the masks were meant to protect their eyes from the light emitted by a spacecraft. At first glance, it makes for a compelling story, but it is important to distinguish between legend and evidence. No official investigative record has ever concluded that the two men were attempting to communicate with extraterrestrials. It is true that they were interested in electronics, spiritual phenomena, and had taken part in certain related activities. But to leap from that to the claim that they were preparing for a meeting with beings from another world is a conclusion unsupported by evidence. Over the years, many articles have blurred the line between the official case file and stories that were embellished over time. That is also why the case has become increasingly difficult to separate from myth. There is one detail that receives far less attention, yet it may be one of the most thought-provoking. If Miguel and Manuel had prepared the masks in advance, then they must have known exactly when they were supposed to use them, which suggests they were not caught by surprise, at least in their own minds. Everything was unfolding according to plan. There were no signs of panic, no evidence that either man had tried to remove his mask, no indication that they had attempted to flee. The scene suggests the two men calmly followed each step of their plan, until something happened that ensured they would never stand up again. What puzzled investigators the most was not the existence of the two lead masks. It was the complete absence of any equipment to go with them. If the two men had intended to carry out an electronic experiment, where was the equipment? If they planned to receive a radio signal, where was the transmitter or receiver? If they were waiting for some extraordinary phenomenon, where were the instruments to observe it? The scene was almost completely bare, as though someone had removed the most important items, or perhaps those items had never been brought up the hill in the first place. Those are two very different possibilities, and each one leads the investigation in a completely different direction. While police were still struggling to explain the purpose of the two lead masks, the autopsy report arrived. It was the document everyone hoped would answer the most important question of all. What had killed the two men? But instead of bringing the case to a close, the report only deepened the mystery more than ever. The autopsy, when even the cause of death could not be determined. In any criminal investigation, the autopsy is one of the most important steps a body can reveal. An extraordinary amount of information. The time of death, the cause of death, the type of weapon used, or even how the perpetrator carried out the crime. In the lead masks case, investigators placed great hope in the forensic examination, because if the crime scene revealed nothing, perhaps the victims' bodies would, but instead, the findings pushed the entire investigation into a dead end. After investigators finished processing the scene, the bodies of Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz were transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. From the very beginning, the forensic pathologists faced a major challenge. The two men had not been discovered immediately after their deaths. Based on what police were able to determine, they had been lying on the hillside for approximately 3 days, exposed to the hot, humid climate of Rio de Janeiro state. Decomposition had already begun. That significantly limited the examiner's ability to determine the cause of death. Today, modern techniques such as highly sensitive toxicology testing and advanced DNA analysis can provide far more answers. But in Itiolulu, forensic science was still relatively limited, especially in areas outside the country's major research centers. The forensic pathologists began a thorough examination of both bodies. The first thing they looked for was evidence of violence. Were there stab wounds, gunshot wounds, broken bones, signs of strangulation? The answer was no. There were no serious injuries that could explain their deaths. No fatal wounds. No evidence of an assault with a weapon. No signs of a violent beating. This finding came as a surprise to many investigators. If there had been a killer, that person had left virtually no trace on the victims' bodies. Next, the forensic experts considered whether the two men could have died from natural causes. Could it have been a heart attack, a stroke, or some other severe medical event that struck them both at nearly the same time? The possibility was considered extremely unlikely. Miguel and Manuel were not elderly men. The investigation uncovered no record of any serious pre-existing medical conditions. More importantly, the odds of two people dying from natural causes within the same time frame were extraordinarily low. Investigators quickly set that theory aside. Attention then shifted to the possibility of poisoning. One reason was the note found in one of the victim's pockets. It contained the instruction, "Take the pill." If the two men had indeed swallowed some kind of medication or chemical, could that have been what killed them? The forensic pathologists conducted every test available at the time, but the results provided no clear answer. That does not mean they were definitively not poisoned. It means there was not enough evidence to prove that they were. The distinction is extremely important. In the years that followed, numerous articles and television programs claimed that the two men died from poison. But a careful reading of the official investigative records tells a different story. The forensic experts never reached that conclusion. The reason is straightforward. The bodies had already begun to decompose, and the toxicology capabilities of the mid-1960s were still very limited. If the victims had ingested certain substances that break down rapidly, detecting them after 3 days of exposure to the elements would have been nearly impossible. In other words, the autopsy did not rule out poisoning, but neither could it confirm it. Another question soon emerged. If they had taken a pill, why was there no pill bottle at the scene? No blister pack, no cup of water, no container of any kind. There are 3 possible explanations. The first, they took the pill and disposed of its container themselves before anything happened. That is difficult to explain. If they knowingly came to carry out a ritual or an experiment, there seems to be no clear reason to hide the container. The second possibility, a third person removed those items after the two men died. If that is what happened, whoever it was left the scene with remarkable composure, taking only the critical items, while leaving behind the cash, the watches, and every other valuable possession. The third possibility, the pill mentioned in the note was never brought to the hill at all, or perhaps it was not a pill in the conventional sense. That, however, is only speculation, and there is no evidence to confirm it. Beyond determining the cause of death, the forensic pathologists also tried to establish when the two men had died, but the exact time of death could not be determined with certainty. They could only estimate that the deaths had occurred several days before the bodies were discovered. That made it extremely difficult for investigators to reconstruct the timeline. They did not know whether the two men had climbed the hill immediately after purchasing the raincoats, or whether they had met with someone beforehand. They could not determine whether the men died that same evening or had remained on the hillside for hours before something happened. That gap in the timeline became one of the biggest holes in the entire case. While the forensic experts searched for answers, police returned to the crime scene. They combed through the surrounding area once again, looking for additional footprints, searching for anything that had been left behind, any sign whatsoever that a third person had been there. But the results were virtually non-existent. No new evidence, no murder weapon, no electronic equipment, no additional messages beyond the mysterious note. The deeper the investigation went, the more the case resembled a puzzle with far too many missing pieces. One question continued to weigh heavily on the investigators. It was the character of the two victims. If they had not been forced, if they had gone to the hill of their own free will, if they had willingly put on the masks, then what could have convinced two grown men with stable careers to follow such a strange plan? Perhaps the answer was not waiting at the crime scene, but in the lives Miguel and Manuel had led before they died, their friends, their interests, the private meetings they attended, and the experiments they had taken part in. Perhaps that was the real key to the entire mystery. The victims' secret lives, beliefs, experiments, and the mysterious man. When the crime scene yielded no further clues, and the autopsy failed to determine the cause of death, the investigation was forced in a different direction. If investigators could not discover what had happened on the hillside, then perhaps the answer lay in the lives of the two victims themselves. Detectives returned to Campos dos Goitacazes. They spoke with family members, friends, co-workers, and everyone who had known or worked alongside Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz. Their objective was straightforward: to find out whether there was anything unusual in the lives of these two men that could explain why they had ended up on a remote hillside wearing two lead masks. At first, the witness statements were remarkably consistent. Miguel and Manuel were described as kind, quiet men, responsible, hard-working. They were not known for reckless spending. They did not abuse alcohol, nor were they known to get into fights. Both were family men. No one believed they were facing financial hardship. There were no signs that either had been contemplating suicide. To their neighbors, they appeared to be perfectly ordinary men. But then, some of the statements began to reveal a very different side of their lives. Beyond repairing electronic equipment, Miguel and Manuel shared another passion. They were deeply interested in radio electronics. They spent much of their free time building electronic circuits, experimenting with radio transmitters and receivers, and studying electromagnetic waves. For technology enthusiasts in the 1960s, there was nothing particularly unusual about that. Many technicians of the era built their own radios and communication devices. But for Miguel and Manuel, their interest seemed to extend beyond engineering. According to several people who knew them, the two men were also fascinated by subjects outside the boundaries of conventional science. They read books about spiritual phenomena, took part in discussions about invisible forms of energy, and believed that human beings could access different states of consciousness through certain specialized practices. One important point should be emphasized. These accounts came primarily from witnesses, not from the official findings of the investigation. They help us better understand the victims' interests, but they do not prove what caused their deaths. During the investigation, police also learned that Miguel had attended several gatherings of small groups whose members shared an interest in combining electronics with spiritual phenomena. These were not large organizations, nor were they structured like religious cults. They were simply small circles of people who met to exchange ideas, experiment with electronic devices, and discuss subjects they believed conventional science had yet to explain. Some members believed that messages could be received through radio waves. Others believed it was possible to communicate with entities from other dimensions. Today, many of those ideas are not supported by scientific evidence, but at the time, quite a few people genuinely believed they were on the verge of remarkable new discoveries. It was through gatherings like these that investigators began hearing the same name, a man who reportedly had a significant influence on Miguel. According to several witness statements, he often led experiments that combined electronics with altered states of consciousness. He believed that certain chemical substances could help people enter an extraordinary state of awareness, and from there, receive signals that ordinary human perception could not detect. It is important to be clear. These witness accounts were never fully substantiated. There is no evidence that this man instructed Miguel or Manuel to go to the hillside, nor is there any evidence that he was directly involved in their deaths. But the existence of this figure sent the investigation down an entirely new path. As investigators continued tracing the victims' relationships, they uncovered an incident that had taken place several months before the deaths of Miguel and Manuel. According to investigative records and witness statements, Miguel had previously taken part in a similar experiment with another friend. The two men also used electronic equipment. They also spoke of waiting for a signal, and the experiment likewise involved taking a pill to alter their state of consciousness. What stood out was this: that earlier experiment did not end in tragedy. Everyone involved returned home unharmed. This detail led investigators to a crucial question. Could the trip to Morro do Vintém simply have been a repeat of an experiment Miguel believed had already succeeded once before? If so, the journey to the hill was not a spontaneous decision. It was a plan that had been prepared well in advance. Police then tried to determine who had supplied the pill mentioned in the note, but the investigation produced no clear answers. No one admitted to providing it. There were no receipts, no samples remained for forensic analysis. In the end, the investigation was left with little more than witness accounts, and, like so many other aspects of this case, those accounts were not enough to implicate anyone. While the investigation remained at a standstill, Brazilian newspapers began publishing a flood of stories about secret groups, mystical rituals, and contact with extraterrestrials. The public was quickly captivated. Before long, the case was no longer simply the deaths of two electronics technicians. It had become a cultural phenomenon. Each newspaper added another detail. Each writer proposed a different theory. As the years passed, the line between documented fact and embellished storytelling became increasingly blurred. That is precisely why people studying the case today often struggle to distinguish what was actually recorded in the official investigative files from what was added in the years that followed. After months of investigation, police still found no evidence that Miguel and Manuel had been forced to go. On the contrary, much of the evidence suggested that the two men had gone to the hillside voluntarily. They had prepared the masks themselves. They had brought the note with them, and most likely, they had willingly followed each instruction written on it. If that is true, then the biggest question is no longer who brought them to the hill. It is, what did they believe would happen after they put on those masks? That is a question that no one has been able to answer, even after nearly 60 years. When every lead pointed toward personal beliefs, private experiments, and unverified witness accounts, the investigation entered its final phase. Investigators were forced to do what they had hoped to avoid. They laid every theory on the table, measured each one against the evidence that remained, discarded those that failed to fit the facts, and asked one final question. Was there any theory left that could truly explain everything that happened on Morro do Vintém? Analyzing every theory, which explanation comes closest to the truth? After months of investigation, Brazilian police were forced to accept a difficult reality. They had no killer, no confirmed cause of death, no witnesses who had seen the final hours of Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, which meant, if they were ever going to solve the case, there was only one path forward. Examine every theory, compare each one against the evidence that remained, and eliminate those that did not fit. Even today, that remains the most reasonable approach, because no single theory can fully explain every detail of the case. Theory 1. A failed experiment. This is the theory that many researchers consider the most plausible, because it aligns with a significant amount of the available evidence. Miguel and Manuel were both electronics technicians. They shared a passion for radio technology, according to people who knew them. They had participated in experiments involving altered states of consciousness and phenomena they believed science had yet to explain. When those pieces are put together, one possible scenario emerges. The two men voluntarily climbed the hill, followed the instructions written on the note. At the appointed time, at the designated location, they took a substance, put on the masks, and waited for something to happen. If that substance triggered an unexpected reaction, death may have come very quickly. There would have been no struggle, no signs of resistance, and the scene would have remained almost exactly as it was found. This theory accounts for many aspects of the case, but it still leaves one major question unanswered. If this was an experiment, what exactly were they trying to test? No document has ever answered that question. Theory 2. Poisoning from a psychoactive substance. Some researchers have suggested that the pill mentioned in the note may have been a hallucinogen, or another substance that affects the nervous system. During the Isolulines, many groups around the world believed certain substances could expand human consciousness or induce unusual mental states. If Miguel and Manuel shared those beliefs, then taking a pill before waiting for the signal becomes easier to understand. However, this theory faces two major obstacles. The first, the autopsy did not establish that they died from poisoning. The second, if both men took the same substance, why was there no trace of a pill bottle or any other container at the scene? Perhaps those items were removed afterward, or perhaps they had never been there in the first place. Theory 3. A third person was involved. From the earliest days of the investigation, some police investigators believed there had been more than 2 people on the hillside that day. Their reasoning was fairly straightforward. The note instructed, "Arrive at the designated location," which suggests someone may have arranged to meet Miguel and Manuel there. If so, where did that person go? There are 2 possibilities. The first, that person left before the 2 men died. The second, that person remained after their deaths, removed the critical items, and then disappeared. This theory offers a possible explanation for why no pill was found, why no electronic equipment was recovered, and why nothing related to the mysterious signal was ever discovered. But it also faces one major problem. There is no evidence that a third person was ever at the scene. No witnesses, no clearly identifiable footprints, no signs of a struggle. In the end, it remains a theory supported only by inference. Theory 4. A staged murder. This is the theory most often featured in documentaries. According to this scenario, the killer poisoned the victims or rendered them incapable of resisting, then arranged the scene to make it appear they had died during some bizarre ritual. At first glance, it is a compelling theory. But when measured against the investigative record, it reveals several significant weaknesses. If the killer deliberately staged the scene, why leave behind the cash, the watches, the note, the 2 lead masks? These pieces of evidence only made the case more unusual and attracted even greater public attention if the objective was to conceal a crime. Creating such a bizarre crime scene would have offered little advantage. More importantly, there was no clear motive. Investigators found no evidence that either Miguel or Manuel had enemies who wanted them dead. That does not make the murder theory impossible, but neither does it make it the most convincing explanation. Theory 5. UFO involvement. This is the most famous theory, and the one that brought the lead masks case to worldwide attention. It emerged for several reasons. The 2 victims had an interest in spiritual phenomena. The note instructed them to wait for the signal. They put on the lead masks shortly before their deaths, and at the time, Brazilian newspapers were filled with reports of alleged UFO sightings. When all of those elements are combined, many people came to believe that Miguel and Manuel were attempting to establish contact with extraterrestrials. Some reports even claimed the 2 men were waiting for a spacecraft to appear, or that the masks were intended to protect their eyes from the brilliant light emitted by an unidentified flying object. It is, without question, a fascinating story. But the problem is simple. There is no evidence to support it. No witness reported seeing an unidentified flying object at the time of the men's deaths. No physical evidence was recovered. No scientific data supports the claim. The entire theory rests largely on speculation. That is why, despite its enduring popularity in popular culture, the UFO theory has never been regarded by investigators as the official explanation. So which theory is the most plausible? If we look only at the evidence that remains, many researchers today believe the most likely explanation is this. Miguel and Manuel voluntarily took part in an activity they genuinely believed in. It may have been an experiment, it may have been a ritual, or it may have been a combination of electronics, spiritual beliefs, and the use of an unidentified substance. What happened after that? No one knows. Perhaps they unknowingly took a fatal substance. Perhaps a third person left the scene after events spiraled beyond anyone's control. Or perhaps the real answer disappeared, along with evidence that was never found. That is why, even after nearly 60 years, no single theory has been able to account for every detail of the case. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this case is not that we still don't know how they died. It is that we also don't know what they believed in the final hours of their lives. Did they truly think they were about to witness something extraordinary? Did they believe they would wake up after the pill had taken effect? Or were they simply following the instructions of someone they trusted completely? Those questions may never be answered, because the only people who knew the truth were the two men who remained on the slopes of Morro do Vintém in the winter of 1966. Why was the case never solved? The missing pieces lost to time. For most unsolved cases, people tend to believe that with better technology, with DNA analysis, a new witness, or a long overdue confession, the truth will eventually come to light. But the lead mask's case belongs to a very different category. It is the kind of case where, from the very beginning, the most critical pieces of evidence disappeared one by one. And once that happens, even the greatest advances in modern forensic science can do little to fill the gaps. The first issue to consider is the timing of the discovery. Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz were not found immediately after their deaths. Their bodies remained on the hillside for approximately 3 days, exposed to the hot, humid climate of Rio de Janeiro state. That was more than enough time for decomposition to begin. For forensic pathologists, 3 days can make a tremendous difference. Certain chemical traces begin to break down. Some unstable compounds may no longer be detectable using the forensic techniques available at the time. And if the true cause of death involved a toxic substance or an unusual drug, the chances of identifying it accurately were greatly reduced. The second challenge was that the crime scene was never secured from the very beginning. Before the police arrived, several local residents had already climbed the hillside. They stood around the two bodies, observed the scene, talked among themselves. Some even approached the bodies at close range. Today, a scene like this would be sealed off immediately. Every footprint, every strand of hair, every fingerprint would be carefully documented and preserved. But in Ezio Lulu, criminal investigation procedures in Brazil were not yet that advanced. No one can say with certainty that the scene investigators examined was still exactly as it had been at the moment the two men died. Another factor was just as important. There were no witnesses. No one saw Miguel and Manuel make their way up the hillside. No one saw them meet anyone else. No one witnessed what happened during the final hours of their lives. Which means, the most critical period of the entire case remains a complete blank. Investigators know only this: the two men bought raincoats. Then, 3 days later, they were found dead. Everything that happened in between remains almost entirely lost to the darkness. Then came the problem of the physical evidence. The scene contained a note, 2 lead masks, cash, watches. But it did not contain the items that should have been there. No pill bottle, no cup, no electronic equipment, no radio transmitter or receiver, no tools of any kind that could be linked to an experiment. This creates a contradiction. If the two men had truly prepared for a specific plan, then the most important objects were missing. If someone removed them, who was that person? And why take only those particular items? To this day, no one has been able to answer. Years later, some hoped the investigative files might reveal something new, but that never happened. Instead, as time passed, some witnesses died. The memories of those who remained began to fade. Many accounts started to contradict one another, and certain details were repeated by the press so many times that it became difficult to distinguish the original testimony from the stories added later. This often happens in famous unsolved cases, as newspapers, books, and documentaries continue retelling the story, the truth can become buried beneath the very theories people create to explain it. There is something worth noting. If we examine the newspaper reports published immediately after the case, their tone was relatively cautious. Journalists focused mainly on the crime scene, witness statements, and the results of the investigation. But only a few years later, as the story was repeated again and again, more sensational elements began to appear. UFOs, extraterrestrials, secret cults, supernatural experiments. Many of those details were never mentioned in the original investigative records. They were added over time. Through each new book, each new article, each television program. That is why anyone researching this case today must proceed with extreme caution. Because sometimes the detail repeated most often is not the one supported by the strongest evidence. If we examine the entire case through the standards of modern criminal investigation, we can reach several conclusions with a reasonable degree of certainty. First, Miguel and Manuel went to Morro do Ventam voluntarily. There is no evidence that they were abducted. Second, the two men had prepared in advance. The note, the masks, and the precise schedule all suggest they were carrying out a plan. Third, there is no clear evidence of robbery. Their money and possessions remained at the scene. Fourth, no cause of death was ever established, and this is the most important point. Every theory must begin by acknowledging that we still do not know exactly what caused those two men to die. Perhaps that is precisely why this case has endured through history, not because it has the greatest number of theories, but because every theory explains part of the mystery, yet none of them explains it all. A failed experiment, perhaps, but it cannot account for the unknown cause of death. Poisoning, possible, but there is no forensic evidence to support it. A third person? Certainly plausible, but there is no trace that such a person was ever there. UFOs, by far the most famous theory, but one entirely without evidence. It is a circle, one that, for nearly 60 years, no one has been able to break. And then, as time passed, the investigation gradually came to an end. Not because the police had found the answer, but because there was simply nothing left to investigate. No suspect, no new evidence, no viable leads remaining. The case file was archived, but it was never truly closed in the public imagination, because every time someone sees the photograph of the two men lying on the hillside, wearing their lead masks, the same question returns. What really happened on the afternoon of August 17th, 1966? Perhaps it is a question that will continue to be asked for many years to come. Conclusion. The real mystery was never the lead masks. It was human belief. Nearly 60 years have passed. The hillside of Morro do Ventam is still there. The city of Niterói has changed dramatically. New roads have been built. New neighborhoods have grown. And most of the people who took part in the original investigation in 1966 are no longer with us. Yet the lead masks case remains one of the most famous mysteries in Brazilian history. Not because it claimed many lives, nor because of extraordinary violence, but because it is one of the very few criminal cases in which almost every important question remains unanswered. Even today, we still do not know what truly caused the deaths of Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz. We do not know what the pill mentioned in the note actually was. We do not know whether the signal they were waiting for ever came. We do not know what protect the metals was really meant to mean. We do not know why they put on their lead masks just before the final moments of their lives. And we still do not know whether there was, in fact, a third person on that hillside. Those questions have endured for nearly 6 decades, and very likely will endure for many decades more. If we examine the case through the lens of modern criminal investigation, perhaps the most plausible explanation is this. Miguel and Manuel voluntarily took part in a plan they genuinely believed in. It may have been an experiment. It may have been a ritual rooted in spiritual beliefs. Or it may have been a combination of electronics, personal conviction, and an unidentified substance. But whatever that plan was, it ended in a way they themselves likely never expected. Even so, that remains only a theory. Because criminal investigations are not built on what merely seems plausible, they are built on evidence. And in this case, the evidence was never sufficient to reach a final conclusion. There is one remarkable aspect of this case. Over the years, the story of the two lead masks has gradually become more famous than the case file itself. It has appeared in books, documentaries, television programs, UFO forums, and countless collections of mysterious stories. With every retelling, a new detail is added. A new theory emerges. A new explanation is proposed, to the point that many people now believe the mystery has already been solved. But the truth is, that never happened. Many of the details, commonly repeated today, do not appear anywhere in the original investigative records. It is a reminder that, once a criminal case becomes a legend, the legend often grows faster than the truth. Perhaps, what has kept the lead masks case alive for nearly 60 years is not the possibility of extraterrestrial visitors, nor theories about mysterious forms of energy, nor even the two lead masks themselves. It is that this case reflects something deeply human. People are driven to search for answers to what they cannot understand, when science cannot yet provide an explanation. Some turn to belief. When technology reaches its limits, others place their hope in possibilities beyond the boundaries of science. Miguel and Manuel lived in an era when the line between scientific exploration and personal belief was sometimes remarkably thin. They were electronics technicians, men who loved technology, but at the same time, they were curious about the unknown. That curiosity may have led them to the slopes of Morro du Vintem, and it may also have cost them their lives. But precisely because so much remains unknown, we must be cautious. There is no evidence that they encountered extraterrestrials, no evidence that they belonged to a dangerous cult, no evidence confirming they were poisoned, and no evidence proving this was a murder. The only thing the case file truly tells us is this. Two ordinary men prepared for a meeting, carried a handwritten set of instructions, put on lead masks, and were found dead several days later. Everything else is made up of the gaps that people have tried to fill with theories. There is one question that people often ask. If this case had happened today, would we finally know the answer? Perhaps. Security cameras might have recorded the victims' movements. Mobile phone records could have revealed who they had been in contact with. Modern toxicology might have identified compounds that were impossible to detect in 1966. DNA analysis might have uncovered traces left by another person, if anyone had truly been at the scene. But all of that remains hypothetical, because this case occurred at a time when forensic technology was still in its infancy, and what was lost may have been lost forever. Perhaps that is what truly makes this case so extraordinary. Not because we lack the intelligence to solve it, but because the most important pieces of the puzzle disappeared in the very first days of the investigation. And once that happens, even the greatest advances in modern science cannot turn back time. To this day, if you search for images of the lead masks case, you will still see the same haunting scene. Two men lying side by side on a hillside, dressed in suits, wearing raincoats, their eyes covered by lead masks. It is a photograph with no blood, no visible violence, no killer. Yet it leaves a deeper sense of unease than many murder cases, because every time we look at it, we are reminded that some mysteries do not endure because they are impossibly complex. They endure because The only people who knew the truth are no longer alive to tell it. And perhaps the most important question this case leaves behind is not what killed Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, but rather, what did they believe so deeply that they willingly climbed that hillside, put on those lead masks, and waited for a signal the world may never know? Perhaps that is the real mystery of the lead masks case.